The blood on Katherine Williams' hands was her own, seeping from the cuts on her palms where she'd fallen when Charles pushed her from the wagon and left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child growing inside her. The trading post at Socorro, New Mexico Territory, loomed before her like a mirage in the late afternoon sun of 1878, its weathered wooden facade offering her only hope of shelter as the distant rumble of thunder threatened rain. Katherine pulled herself up from the dusty road, one hand instinctively cradling her swollen belly as she stumbled toward the trading post. 5 months pregnant and abandoned by the man who'd promised to marry her once they reached California. The same man who'd discovered her condition 2 days ago and decided she was now a burden rather than the asset he'd claimed she would be when convincing her to leave St. Louis. "Miss, you all right there?" The voice came from the doorway of the trading post, belonging to a weathered man with gray whiskers and concerned eyes. "Aye." Katherine swallowed, her throat dry from the dust and from holding back tears. "I need help." The old man Samuel Weaver, according to the name stitched on his apron, ushered her inside the trading post. The interior smelled of leather, coffee, and tobacco. A few patrons glanced her way, their eyes lingering on her disheveled appearance before politely looking away. "You're bleeding," Samuel said, guiding her to a chair behind the counter. "And in a family way, I see." Katherine nodded, unable to form words as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. 23 years old, pregnant, and abandoned in a territory where she knew no one. The life she'd planned, the respectable marriage Charles had promised, had vanished like morning mist under the harsh western sun. "That no-good bastard just left her here," Samuel explained to his wife Martha, who had emerged from the back room with a basin of water and clean cloth. "Pushed her out of the wagon right on the road. Didn't even slow down." Martha, a kindly woman with silver-streaked hair and capable hands, clucked her tongue as she cleaned Katherine's cuts. "The world's full of such men, I'm afraid." "What's your name, dear?" "Katherine. Katherine Williams." She winced as the cloth passed over a particularly deep cut. "I don't know what to do. I have no money, no family here. Charles took everything." "You can stay with us tonight," Martha offered, though Katherine caught the worried glance she exchanged with her husband. The trading post wasn't a hotel, and the Weavers lived in cramped quarters behind the store. "Thank you," Katherine whispered, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same problem, only with more desperation. The door to the trading post swung open, bringing with it a gust of wind and the earthy scent of coming rain. A tall man ducked through the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. He removed his hat, revealing sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His dark blonde hair, cut shorter than most men wore it out here, suggested a recent visit to a barber. "Evening, Sam," the man said, his deep voice carrying across the store. "Got those supplies I ordered?" "Sure do, Bryce," Samuel replied, rising from beside Katherine. "Got them all ready for you." Katherine kept her gaze lowered, embarrassed by her appearance and situation, but couldn't help watching through her lashes as the man Bryce approached the counter. His movements were deliberate, like those of someone accustomed to hard work but not hurried by it. When he reached the counter, his eyes met hers briefly, and Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks at being caught staring. "This here is Miss Williams," Samuel said, gesturing toward Katherine. "Just arrived in town under some difficult circumstances." Bryce O'Malley nodded politely to Katherine before turning his attention back to Samuel. "Got room for the extra flour and sugar I mentioned? Winter's coming, and I've a feeling it'll be a harsh one." While Samuel gathered the additional supplies, Martha continued tending to Katherine's hands. The older woman's gentle touch and kind eyes made Katherine's throat tighten with emotion. She hadn't experienced such compassion since leaving her aunt's home in St. Louis. "There now," Martha said, finishing her ministrations. "They're not too deep, thank the Lord." They'll heal quick enough if kept clean. Thank you, Katherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bryce finished his business with Samuel, paying for his supplies and arranging for them to be loaded onto his wagon. As he turned to leave, he paused, his gaze falling on Katherine once more. This time, she met his eyes directly, refusing to show more weakness than her situation already revealed. "Miss Williams," he said with a slight nod before placing his hat back on his head and walking out. Katherine watched him go, wondering what kind of man he was. Not that it mattered. She would likely never see him again, and she had far more pressing concerns like where she would sleep tomorrow night and how she would feed herself and her unborn child. The first fat drops of rain hit the roof of the trading post as Samuel closed the door behind Bryce. The gentle patter quickly became a steady drumming as the storm arrived in full force, matching the tempest of Katherine's thoughts as she contemplated her uncertain future. "Let's get you settled in for the night," Martha said, helping Katherine to her feet. "Things often look brighter in the morning." Katherine nodded, but couldn't bring herself to believe those words. In her experience, troubles rarely disappeared with the sunrise. They only became clearer in the light of day. The small room behind the trading post was cramped but clean. A narrow cot had been hastily prepared for her, and Katherine sank onto it gratefully, her body aching from the day's trauma. Martha brought her a bowl of stew and a cup of tea, both of which Katherine consumed with the hunger of someone who hadn't eaten since morning. "Rest now," Martha instructed, taking the empty dishes. "We'll figure something out tomorrow." Left alone, Katherine finally allowed her tears to fall. She cried silently for the dreams that had died, for the trust she had misplaced, and for the child who would enter the world unwanted by its father. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she slept to the sound of rain on the tin roof. Katherine woke to the smell of coffee and the murmur of voices. Sunlight streamed through the small window, casting a golden rectangle on the rough wooden floor. For a moment, she was disoriented, but then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the reassuring movement of the child within. "At least we're still together," she whispered to her unborn baby. After splashing her face with water from the basin Martha had thoughtfully left for her, Katherine straightened her clothes as best she could and stepped into the main area of the trading post. Samuel and Martha were engaged in conversation with another man, Bryce O'Malley, from the previous evening. All three looked up as Katherine entered. "Good morning, Miss Williams," Samuel greeted. "Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," she lied, not wanting to burden them with the truth of her restless night filled with anxious thoughts. "Miss Williams," Bryce said, tipping his hat to her. In the clear morning light, she could see him better than she had in the dimness of the previous evening. He was perhaps 30 years old, his face weathered by sun and wind but not unkindly so. There was a steadiness to him that Katherine couldn't help but notice, a quality so different from Charles's flashy charm. "We've been discussing your situation," Martha said, gesturing for Katherine to join them at the small table. Katherine approached cautiously, her stomach knotting with anxiety. "I don't want to be a burden." "No one's suggesting you are," Samuel assured her. "But Socorro's a small town. There's not much in the way of lodging for single women, especially women in my condition," Katherine finished for him, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Martha reached over and patted her hand. "It's not fair, dear, but it's the way things are. The boarding house won't take you, and Mrs. Peterson's girls aren't the sort of company a lady like yourself should keep." Katherine understood what Martha was saying. The local brothel might be the only place willing to house her, but at what cost to her reputation and safety? "I have a proposition for you, Miss Williams," Bryce said, his deep voice breaking into her thoughts. "I own a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. It's a good piece of land with a solid house on it. I've been working it alone since my brother died last year. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that my home needs a family. And you, it appears, need a home. Katherine stared at him, trying to understand what he was proposing. Are you offering me charity, Mr. O'Malley? No, madam. His eyes met hers directly. I'm offering you a partnership of sorts. I need help running the household, cooking, keeping accounts, that sort of thing. In exchange, you and your child would have a roof over your heads, food on the table, and my protection. It's not charity if both parties benefit. Katherine's mind raced. Was this man, this stranger, offering her a lifeline or setting a trap? She'd been deceived once before by a charming smile and pretty promises. But there was something different about Bryce O'Malley, a straightforwardness that Charles had never possessed. Why would you do this for someone you don't know? She asked, unable to hide her suspicion. Bryce's expression remained calm under her scrutiny. I was raised to believe that a man helps those in need when he can. And I won't lie, I've been lonely since Thomas passed. The house is too quiet, too empty. And running a ranch while trying to keep a household is wearing me down. What would people say? Katherine pressed. A single woman living with a single man? They'll talk, Samuel interjected. Folks always do. But Bryce is respected in these parts. His word carries weight. And I'd be clear with anyone who asked that you're my housekeeper, Bryce added. Nothing improper about that. Katherine wasn't convinced. And when my child is born, what then? Then there will be a child on the O'Malley ranch, Bryce said simply. Children belong on ranches. They bring life to a place. Katherine looked to Martha, seeking the older woman's opinion. Martha gave her an encouraging nod. I've known Bryce since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. He's a good man, Katherine. Honest as the day is long. Katherine took a deep breath, weighing her options, which were few. She could try to find work in town, but who would hire a visibly pregnant woman? She could attempt to continue her journey west, but with what money? Or she could accept this unexpected offer from a man who seemed genuinely kind. I accept your offer, Mr. O'Malley, she said finally, on a trial basis. If either of us finds the arrangement unsatisfactory, we part ways with no ill feelings. A small smile lifted the corner of Bryce's mouth. That seems fair, Miss Williams. And please call me Bryce. Then you must call me Katherine. They shook hands to seal their agreement, his large hand engulfing her smaller one with unexpected gentleness. Katherine felt a curious flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby. Perhaps, just perhaps, her luck was finally changing. Within the hour, Katherine found herself seated beside Bryce on the bench of his wagon, heading away from Socorro toward the O'Malley ranch. Martha had hastily gathered a few necessities for her, a change of clothes, some basic toiletries, but Katherine's worldly possessions still fit easily into a single small bag. The April morning was pleasantly warm, the air fresh after the previous night's rain. The landscape spread out before them, a tapestry of desert colors under the vast blue sky. Katherine had never seen such open space, and despite her circumstances, she couldn't help but be awed by its beauty. Have you always lived in New Mexico territory? She asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Bryce shook his head. Born in Boston, actually. My father was a shipwright. When he died, my mother brought Thomas and me west. She had a brother in Santa Fe who'd done well for himself. What made you settle in Socorro? Land was cheaper here, Bryce replied, and I liked the feel of the place. Small enough to know your neighbors, big enough that they don't know all your business. He glanced at her. What about you? Where's home? St. Louis, Katherine said. My parents died when I was 16. I lived with my aunt until... She trailed off, not ready to share the full story of her gullibility. of how Charles had swept her off her feet with promises of adventure and prosperity in California. Bryce seemed to sense her reluctance. Well, New Mexico's a fine place to make a new start. It's still rough around the edges, but there's opportunity here for those willing to work for it. They fell silent again as the wagon rolled along the rutted road. Katherine's mind churned with questions about what awaited her. What would the ranch be like? How would she manage her duties as her pregnancy progressed? And most importantly, what kind of man was Bryce O'Malley? Really? As if reading her thoughts, Bryce said, "It's not much to look at, but it's home." Katherine followed his gaze to where the road curved around a stand of cottonwoods. Beyond them stood a modest but well-maintained adobe and timber house. A barn and several outbuildings were arranged nearby, and a corral held several horses. Fields stretched out behind the house, some planted with what looked like corn and others serving as grazing land for cattle. "It's lovely," Katherine said, and meant it. After weeks of traveling, the sight of the solid house with smoke curling from its chimney stirred a longing in her she hadn't expected. Bryce steered the wagon into the yard and brought it to a halt in front of the house. "Welcome to the O'Malley Ranch," he said, hopping down from the bench and coming around to help her descend. His hands were strong and sure as they gripped her waist, lifting her easily despite her increased weight. When her feet touched the ground, he didn't immediately release her, and Katherine found herself looking up into his face, suddenly aware of how tall he was compared to her modest height. "Thank you," she murmured, stepping back. "Let me show you around," Bryce said, picking up her bag from the wagon bed. "I'll get the supplies later." The house was larger than it appeared from outside. The front door opened directly into a spacious main room with a stone fireplace at one end and a kitchen area at the other. A solid table with 6 chairs dominated the center of the space. 2 doors led off from the main room. "That's my room," Bryce said, indicating the door to the left. "And this one will be yours." He opened the right-hand door, revealing a cozy bedroom with a brass bed, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk beneath a window that overlooked a kitchen garden. "It was Thomas's," Bryce explained. "I haven't had the heart to change anything." Katherine stepped into the room, touched by the trust implied in his offering his brother's space to her. "It's perfect," she said. "Thank you." Bryce nodded, seeming pleased by her reaction. "There's an outhouse behind the kitchen garden, and a pump for water by the back door. We heat water for bathing on Saturday nights more often in summer. The bathtub's in the storage room off the kitchen." He led her back to the main room. "I usually handle the stock and fields, and you'll manage the house. I'm not much of a cook, I'm afraid, so meals have been simple. But I keep a good garden and we raise chickens for eggs. The pantry's well stocked, and I trade with the Pueblo Indians for things we don't grow or raise ourselves." Katherine took it all in, already making mental notes about what needed to be done. The house was reasonably tidy for a bachelor's dwelling but could use a woman's touch. The kitchen appeared functional if basic. "I'll need to know your preferences," she said, professional in her new role as housekeeper. "What time you prefer meals, how you like things cooked, that sort of thing." "I'm not particular," Bryce replied. "Just grateful not to be eating my own cooking anymore." The corner of his mouth quirked up in a small smile that transformed his serious face. Katherine found herself smiling back, surprising herself. Yesterday, she'd been abandoned and desperate. Today, she had a roof over her head and work to do. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, but it was better than she'd feared. "I should unpack and start dinner," she said, suddenly aware that they'd been standing in the middle of the room, smiling at each other like old friends instead of near strangers bound by an unusual arrangement. "Of course," Bryce nodded. "I've got chores to finish. Take your time settling in. Supper's usually at sunset, but there's no rush today." With that, he left her alone in the house, his house, she reminded herself. Her home now too, at least temporarily. Katherine stood in the center of the main room, taking in the modest furnishings, the walls adorned with a few faded photographs and a gun rack, the books stacked neatly on a shelf by the fireplace. It was a man's home, functional rather than decorative, but clean and solid. She went to her new room and began unpacking the few belongings Martha had provided. As she worked, she spoke softly to her unborn child. "We're safe for now, little one. Mr. O'Malley seems kind. We'll make this work somehow, you and I." The baby kicked in response, and Katherine smiled, placing her hand over the spot. Perhaps things would turn out all right after all. Over the next several days, Katherine settled into life at the O'Malley Ranch. She rose early each morning to prepare breakfast before Bryce headed out to work the cattle or tend to the fields. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, and learning the rhythm of ranch life. Each evening, they shared a meal at the big table, their conversation gradually becoming easier as they grew more comfortable with each other. She discovered that Bryce was a man of few words but thoughtful ones. He never asked about the father of her child, for which she was grateful. Instead, he spoke of practical matters: the weather, the livestock, news from town when he went in for supplies. Occasionally, he shared stories of his childhood in Boston or his early years in New Mexico. In return, Katherine told him about growing up in St. Louis, carefully editing out the parts of her life that still brought her shame. A week after her arrival, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Bryce cleared his throat in a way that Katherine had come to recognize as a prelude to something he found difficult to say. "I was thinking," he began, "that we should ride into town tomorrow. You could use some proper clothing and things for the baby. And it might be good for folks to see you as part of the household now." Katherine tensed. She hadn't ventured beyond the ranch since arriving, content to postpone facing the judgment of Socorro's residents. "Do you think that's necessary? People will talk less if we're open about our arrangement," Bryce said reasonably. "Besides, you can't stay hidden away forever." Katherine knew he was right, but the thought of facing strangers' stares made her stomach knot with anxiety. "Very well," she agreed reluctantly. "But I have no money for clothes or baby things." "That's part of our arrangement," Bryce reminded her. "You keep the house, I provide what's needed. Consider it an advance on your wages if you prefer." Katherine wanted to protest but knew it would be foolish to refuse. She did need proper clothing, and the baby would arrive in approximately 4 months. "Thank you," she said instead. "That's very generous." The next morning, Katherine dressed in her best, which wasn't saying much, given her limited wardrobe and expanding waistline. She'd managed to let out the seams of her dress as much as possible, but it was still uncomfortably tight. She pinned her honey-brown hair in a neat bun and washed her face with cold water, hoping to present a respectable appearance despite her condition. Bryce had hitched the wagon and was waiting for her in the yard. He wore clean clothes and had trimmed his beard, she noticed. When he saw her, his eyes widened slightly before he quickly composed his features. "Ready?" he asked, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. "As I'll ever be," Katherine replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. The journey to Socorro was pleasant, the May morning filled with birdsong and the scent of desert flowers. Katherine found herself relaxing as Bryce pointed out landmarks and told her about the neighboring ranches they passed. By the time the town came into view, she'd almost forgotten her nervousness. Socorro looked different in daylight than it had on the rainy evening of her arrival. The main street was lined with a mix of adobe and wooden buildings, some quite substantial, others little more than shacks. People moved about their business, women shopping, men gathered outside the saloon, children playing in the dusty street. Bryce guided the wagon to a hitching post outside the general store. As he helped Katherine down, she was acutely aware of the eyes upon them. A group of women standing nearby fell silent, watching with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Hendricks," Bryce called, tipping his hat to one of the women. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" The woman, a plump matron in a severe black dress, stepped forward. "Indeed it is, Mr. O'Malley. Who might your companion be?" Bryce placed a protective hand at the small of Katherine's back. "This is Miss Williams, my new housekeeper. Miss Williams, Mrs. Hendricks is our postmistress and the wife of the town doctor." Katherine forced a polite smile. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Hendricks." The woman's eyes traveled from Katherine's face to her swollen belly and back again. "Housekeeper, you say? How convenient for you both." The insinuation was clear, and Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. Before she could respond, Bryce spoke, his voice carrying just enough edge to make Mrs. Hendricks take a small step back. "Miss Williams is providing a much-needed service at my ranch. I trust the good people of Socorro will extend her the same courtesy they've shown me these past years." The challenge in his tone was unmistakable. Mrs. Hendricks glanced at her companions, who were watching the exchange with avid interest. "Of course, Mr. O'Malley. Socorro has always been a welcoming town." "Glad to hear it," Bryce said. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have errands to run." He guided Katherine past the group and into the general store, his hand remaining steady at her back. Once inside, he leaned down to murmur in her ear, "Don't mind them. They'll find something new to gossip about by next week." Katherine wasn't so sure, but she appreciated his attempt to reassure her. The interior of the store was a welcome relief from the scrutiny outside. It was filled with goods of all descriptions: clothing, fabric, tools, household items, food staples, even toys and books. Mr. O'Malley, the shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, hurried forward to greet them. "Good to see you. And who's this lovely lady?" "This is Miss Williams, my housekeeper," Bryce said, and Katherine braced herself for another reaction like Mrs. Hendricks's. But the shopkeeper merely smiled and extended his hand. "Edwin Cooper at your service, Miss Williams. Any friend of Mr. O'Malley's is welcome in my store." Katherine shook his hand, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Miss Williams needs some clothing," Bryce explained, "and anything you might have for a baby due in late summer." If Mr. Cooper was surprised or scandalized by this information, he didn't show it. Of course. The ladies' ready-made things are along the back wall. My wife can help with alterations if needed. And we just got in a shipment of baby goods from back east. Very fine quality." He led them through the store, pointing out items he thought might interest them. Katherine selected several dresses that could be altered to accommodate her growing belly, undergarments, a warm shawl for evenings, and a pair of sturdy boots. For the baby, she chose the essential soft flannel blankets, tiny gowns, diapers, and a beautiful cradle that Mr. Cooper assured her was made by the finest carpenter in Santa Fe. Throughout the shopping excursion, Bryce remained at her side, offering opinions when asked but generally deferring to her judgment. When it came time to pay, he did so without comment on the total, though Katherine winced inwardly at the expense. As they left the store, arms laden with packages, Katherine said quietly, "Thank you. I'll work hard to repay your kindness." Bryce glanced down at her, a slight frown creasing his brow. "There's no debt between us, Katherine. This is part of our arrangement. Remember?" Before she could respond, a voice called out from across the street. "Bryce O'Malley, you old dog. I heard you'd taken up with a pretty lady." A tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest approached, grinning broadly. Bryce's expression lightened. "Sheriff Wilson. Just the man I wanted to see." The sheriff reached them, his curious gaze taking in Katherine's condition before returning to Bryce. "I'm sure you did. Word travels fast in Socorro." "Then let me make sure the word is accurate," Bryce said firmly. "This is Miss Katherine Williams, my housekeeper." "Miss Williams, Sheriff James Wilson." The sheriff tipped his hat to Katherine. "Madam, welcome to Socorro." "Thank you, Sheriff," Katherine replied, relieved by his courteous manner. "Miss Williams is under my protection," Bryce continued, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable message. "I'd appreciate it if you'd make that known to anyone who might be confused about the situation." Sheriff Wilson's expression grew serious. "I understand completely, Bryce. I'll make sure folks know to mind their manners where the lady is concerned." "Much obliged," Bryce said, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. After a brief conversation about local matters, they parted ways with the sheriff and continued to the wagon. As Bryce loaded their purchases, Katherine noticed more curious stares from passersby, some friendly, others less so. "Perhaps we should visit the Weavers before heading back," she suggested, wanting to see the kind couple who had helped her in her darkest moment. "Good idea," Bryce agreed. "Martha's been asking after you." The trading post was busy with customers, but Martha spotted them immediately, hurrying over with open arms. "Katherine, look at you, there's color in your cheeks again. And Bryce, you're looking well too. Been feeding him properly, has she?" "Better than I've eaten in years," Bryce confirmed with a small smile. Martha beamed at them both. "I'm so glad to see you getting along. Come, sit down. Samuel will want to say hello too." She led them to the small table where Katherine had sat on her first night in Socorro. Samuel joined them moments later, and soon they were engaged in comfortable conversation. Katherine found herself relaxing for the first time since arriving in town. The Weavers treated her situation as perfectly normal, asking about her health and the baby's development rather than how she'd come to be with child and without a husband. As they prepared to leave, Martha pulled Katherine aside. "You look happy, dear. Are you?" Katherine considered the question. Was she happy? Her circumstances were far from what she'd dreamed of. "But I'm content," she said truthfully. "Bryce is kind, and the ranch is peaceful. It's more than I dared hope for when Charles abandoned me." Martha squeezed her hand. "That's a start. And who knows what the future holds. Bryce has been alone too long. Having you and the little one around might be just what he needs." Katherine didn't know how to respond to that. She hadn't considered her arrangement with Bryce as anything other than a practical solution to both their problems. But Martha's knowing look suggested she saw something more in their situation. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the journey into town, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the turnoff to the O'Malley property, Bryce finally broke the silence. "I hope today wasn't too difficult for you," he said, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "It was. Educational," Katherine replied. "People will think what they want to think, I suppose." Bryce nodded. "They will. But as long as we know the truth of things between us, their opinions don't much matter. The truth of things between them." Katherine pondered that phrase as they rode the rest of the way home. What was the truth? That she was his housekeeper, dependent on his charity? That they were two lonely people thrown together by circumstance? Or was there something else developing? Something neither of them had anticipated? As Bryce helped her down from the wagon in front of their house, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and Katherine saw something in his gaze that made her heart beat faster. "Welcome home," he said softly, and for the first time since leaving St. Louis, Katherine truly felt that she was. The weeks passed, and May gave way to June. The days grew longer and hotter, the desert landscape transforming under the summer sun. Katherine settled more deeply into life at the O'Malley Ranch, finding unexpected contentment in the rhythm of her days. Her body changed too, her belly swelling as the baby grew stronger. Bryce proved to be a considerate employer, never demanding more than she could reasonably manage in her condition. He insisted she rest during the hottest part of the day and often returned from the fields earlier than necessary to check on her. Sometimes, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between concern and a deeper emotion she wasn't ready to name. They developed comfortable routines together. Breakfast at sunrise, a brief discussion of the day's tasks. Then Bryce would head out to work while Katherine managed the household. In the evenings, after supper, they often sat on the porch, watching the spectacular sunsets that painted the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked, sharing stories of their lives before Socorro. Other times, they simply sat in companionable silence. It was during these quiet moments that Katherine began to realize how much she'd come to rely on Bryce's steady presence in her life. He was unlike any man she'd known before, straightforward, reliable, and possessed of a quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself to be felt. One particularly hot evening in late June, as they sat watching the sky turn from blue to indigo, Bryce surprised her by asking, "Was he kind to you?" "The baby's father." Katherine tensed. They hadn't spoken directly of Charles before. "He was charming," she said finally. "I mistook that for kindness, I think." Bryce nodded, his profile outlined against the darkening sky. "You don't have to tell me about him if you don't want to." "No, it's all right." And strangely it was. The pain of Charles's betrayal had dulled over the weeks, replaced by a growing anger at her own naivety. "His name is Charles. He came to St. Louis as a land speculator, or so he claimed. Said he was acquiring property in California and needed a wife to help establish his business there." She paused, remembering how easily she'd believed his lies. "I was lonely after my aunt died. I had no family left, just a small inheritance that wasn't enough to live on indefinitely. When Charles proposed after only a month of courtship, it seemed like the answer to my prayers." "You trusted him," Bryce said, no judgment in his voice. "I did. We were to be married in California. On the journey west he was attentive." Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks, remembering Charles's persuasive words, his insistence that they would soon be husband and wife anyway. "When I realized I was with child, I was frightened but thought he would simply move up our wedding plans." "But he didn't," Bryce guessed. "No. He accused me of trapping him. Said he never intended to marry me at all." The memory still had the power to hurt, though less sharply now. 2 days later, he pushed me from the wagon outside Socorro and drove away. I never saw him again. Bryce was silent for so long that Katherine wondered if she'd shared too much. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "If I ever meet this Charles, he'll answer for what he did to you." The protective fierceness in his tone warmed something inside Katherine. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said softly. "His leaving led me here, and for that, at least, I can't be sorry." Their eyes met in the gathering darkness, and Katherine felt that same inexplicable connection she'd experienced the day they'd returned from town. Bryce reached out slowly, as if giving her time to withdraw, and covered her hand with his own. "Neither am I," he said quietly. They sat that way for a long while, hands joined, watching as stars appeared one by one in the vast desert sky. Katherine knew something had shifted between them, though she wasn't sure exactly what or what it might mean for their future. July brought even hotter weather, the air shimmering above the sun-baked earth. Katherine's pregnancy advanced, making even simple tasks more challenging. Her back ached constantly, and the baby seemed determined to use her ribs for kicking practice. Bryce noticed her discomfort and hired Luisa, a young woman from the nearby pueblo, to help with the heavier household chores 3 days a week. At first, Katherine protested, feeling that she wasn't fulfilling her part of their arrangement. But Bryce was firm. "You're carrying a child, not slacking in your duties." he told her when she raised the issue. Louisa needs the work and you need the help. There's no shame in that. Katherine gradually accepted the assistance, grateful for Louisa's cheerful company and capable hands. The young woman spoke excellent English and was happy to teach Katherine words in her native Tiwa language. She also shared her people's knowledge about childbirth and caring for infants, information Katherine absorbed eagerly. "You are fortunate," Louisa told her one afternoon as they prepared vegetables from the garden. "Mr. O'Malley is a good man. Many men would not be so kind to a woman in your situation." Katherine couldn't disagree. "I know. I'm very grateful to him." Louisa gave her a knowing look. "It is more than kindness I see in his eyes when he watches you, and in yours when you watch him." "I don't know what you mean," Katherine protested, though her flushed cheeks betrayed her. Louisa simply smiled and returned to her task, leaving Katherine to wonder if her growing feelings for Bryce were as obvious to everyone as they apparently were to the perceptive Pueblo woman. Those feelings had indeed been deepening, though Katherine tried to resist them. She told herself it was merely gratitude, or perhaps the natural result of living in close quarters with a handsome, decent man. But in her heart, she knew it was more than that. Bryce's quiet strength, his unfailing consideration, his rare but wonderful smiles, all these things had worked their way into her heart despite her best efforts to maintain a professional distance. But surely he couldn't return such feelings? She was carrying another man's child, after all, and had proven herself a poor judge of character by trusting Charles. What man would want such a woman? As if to answer this unspoken question, Bryce began bringing her small gifts whenever he returned from checking the far pastures or riding into town. A particularly beautiful wildflower, a smooth stone that caught the light in an unusual way. Once, a book of poetry he'd ordered specially from Santa Fe. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said simply when he presented her with the slim volume. "The nights are long when you can't sleep." He'd noticed her restlessness. Then, Katherine was touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. It's a lovely gift." "It's nothing," he said, though his pleased expression suggested otherwise. "Just something to pass the time until the little one arrives." The baby was due in approximately 6 weeks, and thoughts of the birth filled Katherine with equal parts anticipation and dread. She worried about the pain, of course, but more than that, she feared what would happen afterward. Would Bryce still want them in his home once the reality of a newborn with all its crying and mess and demands became clear? One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching a distant thunderstorm paint the horizon with lightning, Katherine found the courage to broach the subject. "I've been thinking about what happens after the baby comes," she began hesitantly. Bryce turned to look at her, his face serious in the fading light. "What about it? Our arrangement was for me to keep house in exchange for lodging. But with a newborn, I won't be able to fulfill my duties properly. At least not at first." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I understand if you'd prefer that I find other accommodations once I'm recovered from the birth." Bryce was silent for so long that Katherine's anxiety mounted. Finally, he said, "Is that what you want? To leave?" "No." The word burst from her with more vehemence than she'd intended. More calmly, she added, "No. But I don't want to take advantage of your kindness either." Katherine, the way he said her name, soft but intense, made her look up and meet his gaze. "I don't want you to leave. Not now, not after the baby comes. Not ever, if I'm being honest." Her heart seemed to stop, then resume at twice its normal pace. "What are you saying, Bryce?" He shifted on the bench, turning to face her more directly. "I'm saying that what began as a practical arrangement has become something else entirely, at least for me. I'm saying that I care for you, Katherine Williams, more than I thought possible." Katherine's breath caught in her throat. "But the baby will be welcome in my home," Bryce said firmly. I told you once that children belong on ranches. I meant it then, and I mean it now. It's not your child, Katherine felt compelled to remind him, though the words hurt to say. It could be, Bryce said quietly. If you'll let me. Katherine stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Are you proposing to me? Bryce reached for her hands, enfolding them in his own. I'm not a man who speaks easily of his feelings, Katherine, but I know what's in my heart, and it's you. You and the child you carry. I'm asking if you might, in time, come to think of me as more than your employer. If you might consider making our arrangement permanent, not out of necessity but out of choice. Tears welled in Katherine's eyes. You would take on another man's child? I would take on your child, Bryce corrected gently, and love it as my own, if you'd allow me that honor. A tear slipped down Katherine's cheek. I don't know what to say. I never expected. You don't have to answer now, Bryce assured her, though she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. Think about it. Talk to the baby about it. His mouth quirked in a small smile. I've heard you doing that, you know. Talking to the little one as if it can answer you. Katherine smiled through her tears. He or she is a very good listener. Bryce reached out and, with a tenderness that made her heart ache, brushed a tear from her cheek. Like the mother, then. In that moment, with the distant thunder rolling across the desert and the scent of rain in the air, Katherine knew her answer. It had been forming in her heart for weeks, perhaps from the moment Bryce had said, "My home needs a family." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Bryce O'Malley." His face transformed with joy, years seeming to fall away as he smiled a full, radiant smile unlike any she'd seen from him before. "You're sure? I don't want you to feel obligated because of our situation." "I'm sure," Katherine said firmly. "I've learned the hard way to recognize the difference between genuine love and mere convenience. What I feel for you is real, Bryce. It crept up on me so gradually that I didn't recognize it at first, but it's been growing stronger every day." Bryce moved closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Katherine?" The formal request, so typical of his respectful nature, made her smile. "You may." His lips met hers gently, a tentative first kiss that quickly deepened as Katherine responded. Unlike Charles's demanding kisses, Bryce's were tender, asking rather than taking. When they finally drew apart, both were breathless. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time," Bryce admitted, his voice husky. "So have I," Katherine confessed, surprising herself with her boldness. Bryce grinned, looking younger and more carefree than she'd ever seen him. "Well then, Miss Williams, it seems we've been in agreement for some time without knowing it." Katherine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "It seems we have, Mr. O'Malley." They sealed their newfound understanding with another kiss, this one longer and deeper than the first. When they separated, Bryce kept his arms around her, one hand gently cradling her swollen belly. As if on cue, the baby kicked against his palm. "Hello there, little one," Bryce said softly. "I'm going to be your pa, if that's all right with you." Another kick, stronger this time, made them both laugh. "I think that's a yes," Katherine said, her heart so full she thought it might burst. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Socorro Church. Martha and Samuel Weaver stood as witnesses, along with Sheriff Wilson and Louisa and her family. Katherine wore a new dress of pale blue, specially made to accommodate her advanced pregnancy, with wildflowers in her hair. Bryce, in a crisp white shirt and his best black suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. "You're beautiful," he whispered as they stood before the preacher. When they exchanged vows, Katherine's voice was clear and steady. The uncertainty that had plagued her for so long had vanished, replaced by a quiet confidence in the man she was marrying and the life they would build together. After the ceremony, their friends accompanied them back to the ranch for a celebration. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food prepared by Martha, Luisa, and other women from town. Musicians from the pueblo played traditional songs, their melodies drifting through the warm August air. As the sun began to set, Sheriff Wilson raised his glass in a toast. To Bryce and Katherine O'Malley, may your home always be filled with love, laughter, and many children. Hear, hear, echoed the guests, clinking their glasses together. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Bryce led Katherine to a quiet spot beneath the old cottonwood tree. From a pocket inside his jacket, he withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper. A wedding gift, he explained, placing it in her hands. It was my mother's. Katherine carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. It's beautiful, she breathed, opening the locket to find it empty, waiting for new memories to fill it. I thought we could put a lock of the baby's hair in it when he or she arrives, Bryce said, helping her fasten the chain around her neck. That's perfect. Katherine touched the locket where it rested against her collarbone. Thank you, not just for this, but for everything, for giving us a home, a family. Bryce gathered her in his arms, mindful of her belly. You've given me just as much, Katherine, more than I ever thought to have again after Thomas died. They stood together under the tree, wrapped in each other's arms as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Katherine felt the baby move within her and smiled, thinking of the family they were creating, not the conventional one she'd once imagined, perhaps, but one built on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine caring, and growing love. 2 weeks after the wedding, in the early hours of a hot August morning, Katherine went into labor. Bryce, alarmed by her first cry of pain, wanted to ride immediately for Dar. Hendricks, but Katherine, remembering Luisa's teachings, assured him there was time. First babies often take a while, she said, breathing through the contraction. Send for Luisa first. She knows what to do. Bryce did as she asked, dispatching a ranch hand to the pueblo while he helped Katherine to their bedroom. By the time Luisa arrived, the contractions were coming more regularly, and Katherine was grateful for the young woman's calm presence and practical knowledge. You are doing well, Mrs. O'Malley, Luisa said, using Katherine's new title with a smile. The baby is strong, like its mother. As the labor progressed and the pain intensified, Katherine was grateful for Bryce's steady support. He stayed with her throughout, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement. When she cried out that she couldn't do it, that it hurt too much, he leaned close and said, You can, my brave Katherine. You're the strongest woman I know. After 14 hours of labor, as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, Katherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. His lusty cry filled the room, bringing tears of joy to her eyes and a look of wonder to Bryce's face. You have a son, Luisa announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant on Katherine's chest after cleaning him. Hello, little one? Katherine whispered, counting his fingers and toes with trembling hands. Welcome to the world. Bryce moved closer, his eyes wide with awe as he gazed at the tiny being they'd created. He's perfect, he breathed, reaching out to touch the baby's cheek with one gentle finger. Would you like to hold your son? Katherine asked, watching Bryce's face carefully. This was the moment of truth, the first time he would hold a child that wasn't his by blood. But there was no hesitation in Bryce's movements as he carefully gathered the baby into his arms. Hello, son, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your pa. The baby blinked up at him, tiny fists waving, and Katherine saw Bryce fall in love in that moment. Whatever doubts she might have harbored about his ability to accept another man's child vanished as she watched him cradle their son with such tenderness. "What shall we name him?" Bryce asked, looking up at Katherine with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one. Now, looking at the strong, handsome man holding her child with such love, Katherine knew. "Thomas," she said softly. "Thomas Samuel O'Malley." Bryce's face filled with emotion. "After my brother? And Samuel Weaver, who helped bring us together," Katherine confirmed. "If you approve?" "It's perfect," Bryce said, his voice breaking slightly. "Thomas Samuel. A fine name for our son. Our son." Two simple words that meant everything. Katherine felt a profound peace settle over her as she watched her husband and child together. This was her family now, not the one she'd expected, but infinitely more precious for being unexpected. Little Thomas grew quickly, thriving under the love and care of both his parents. Bryce proved to be a natural father, endlessly patient with the baby's crying jags and midnight feedings. He insisted on taking his share of the night duties, claiming that ranch work had accustomed him to interrupted sleep. "Besides," he told Katherine one night as he paced the floor with a fussing Thomas, "these moments won't last forever. I don't want to miss them." Katherine's heart swelled with love for this man who had given her and her son so much. Their marriage, begun as a practical arrangement, deepened into a true partnership. They worked side by side to make the ranch prosper, sharing joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. By Thomas's first birthday, Katherine was pregnant again with Bryce's child this time. When she told him the news, his face lit up with the same joy he'd shown when Thomas was born. "Another little O'Malley," he said, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Thomas will make a fine big brother." 7 months later, they welcomed a daughter, Margaret Martha O'Malley, named after both their mothers. Maggie, as they called her, had her father's blue eyes and her mother's honey-brown hair, a perfect blend of them both. Thomas, now approaching 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. "Gentle, gentle," he'd say in his toddler's voice as he patted her head with exaggerated care, mimicking the words his parents had taught him. Watching them together, Katherine often marveled at how life had unfolded. Had she not been abandoned at the Socorro trading post that rainy April evening, she might never have found this happiness. What had seemed like the worst moment of her life had led her to the best. 5 years after their marriage, as they celebrated Christmas with their growing family, Thomas, now a sturdy 6-year-old, Maggie, a precocious 4-year-old, and 2-year-old James crawling on the rug before the fireplace, Katherine shared this thought with Bryce. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting?" she asked as they sat together on the sofa, watching their children play with the wooden toys Bryce had carved for them. Bryce considered this, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I prefer to think that we were always meant to find each other. That all the paths we took, even the painful ones, were leading us here." Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she'd never imagined possible that day when Charles had pushed her from the wagon. "I like that thought," she murmured, "that we were destined for each other, even when we didn't know it." Bryce pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I knew it the moment I saw you at the trading post," he confessed. "There was something about you, despite your circumstances, that called to me. A strength, a dignity. I couldn't get you out of my mind." "Is that why you came back the next day?" Katherine asked, surprised. They'd never discussed this. "It is." Bryce smiled at the memory. "I spent that night thinking about you, wondering how a woman in your situation would manage in Socorro. By morning, I knew I had to offer you a place at the ranch, though I wasn't sure you'd accept." "I almost didn't," Katherine admitted. "I was so afraid of trusting again, of being vulnerable." "I'm glad you took the risk," Bryce said, his voice soft with emotion. "Our home needed a family, but I didn't realize until you came how much I needed one too." Katherine turned her face up to his, and their lips met in a tender kiss that still held all the passion of their early days together. When they parted, she looked into his eyes that had seen her at her most desperate and vulnerable, yet had always looked at her with respect and, eventually, love. "Thank you for taking a chance on me," she whispered. "For seeing beyond my circumstances to who I could be. Thank you for making this house a home," Bryce replied, his gaze taking in their children, the decorated tree, the comfortable room filled with the evidence of their shared life. "For giving me more love than I ever thought possible." As the Christmas Eve fire crackled in the hearth and their children's laughter filled the air, Katherine O'Malley knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey had been unexpected, filled with both heartbreak and joy, but it had led her home to a man who loved her and the children with his whole heart, to a life richer and more fulfilling than any she could have imagined. Outside, snow began to fall softly over the New Mexico landscape, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Inside, wrapped in the warmth of her family's love, Katherine offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her to Socorro, and for the cowboy who had looked at a pregnant, abandoned woman and seen not a burden, but a blessing. Their love story might not have begun like a fairy tale, but Katherine wouldn't change a word of it. For it was the unexpected turns, the challenges overcome together, that had made their bond so strong, a love forged in adversity and tempered by time, a love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives together. 10 years after that fateful day at the Socorro trading post, the O'Malley Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in the territory. Their herd of cattle had tripled in size, and Bryce had expanded their operations to include horses bred specifically for the U.S. Cavalry. The original house had been enlarged to accommodate their family of 6: Thomas, now 11, Maggie, 9, James, 7, and Lucy, their youngest at 4. Katherine, at 33, had grown into her role as the wife of a successful rancher with grace and confidence. The timid, desperate young woman of a decade ago was barely recognizable in the capable, respected Mrs. O'Malley, who now sat on Socorro's school board and organized the annual harvest festival. Bryce, approaching 40, had retained his quiet strength but had learned to smile more easily, to laugh more freely, changes his friends attributed to the influence of his wife and children. His deep love for Katherine had only strengthened over the years, deepened by shared experiences both joyful and painful. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, Bryce surprised Katherine with a special gift: the deed to a small plot of land adjacent to their property, with a spring-fed pond surrounded by cottonwood trees. It was a peaceful spot they'd often visited as a family for picnics and swimming lessons for the children. "This is your land now," he told her as they stood beside the pond on a perfect May afternoon. "To do with as you please." Katherine looked up at him, puzzled but pleased. "It's beautiful, but why?" Bryce took her hands in his expression serious. "When you came into my life, you had nothing of your own. Everything, the house, the ranch, even your clothes, came from me. I wanted you to have something that's truly yours, something no one can ever take from you." Tears filled Katherine's eyes at this tangible proof of how well he understood her, how deeply he respected her need for security after all she'd endured. "Thank you," she whispered, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "I know exactly what I want to do with it." Over the next year, with Bryce's help and the eager assistance of their children, Katherine transformed the land into a sanctuary. She planted fruit trees and berry bushes, created flower gardens that bloomed from early spring through late fall, and built a small gazebo where she could sit and write in the journal she'd kept since Thomas's birth. The secret garden, as the children called it, became Katherine's special place, a symbol of how far she'd come from the desperate young woman abandoned at the trading post. It was there, among the flowers and trees she'd planted with her own hands, that she felt most at peace, most certain of the rightness of the path her life had taken. One summer evening, as they sat together in the gazebo after the children had gone to bed, Bryce asked, "Are you happy, Katherine?" "Truly happy." Katherine looked at her husband of a decade, taking in the familiar lines of his face, the streaks of silver now appearing at his temples, the laugh lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they'd met. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" Bryce's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long familiarity. "Every day with you and the children is a gift I never expected to have. Even on the hard days, maybe especially on those days, I'm grateful for our life together." They sat in companionable silence as twilight deepened around them, listening to the night sounds of the desert, the call of an owl, the rustle of a slight breeze through the cottonwoods, the distant lowing of cattle. "Do you ever wonder about him?" Bryce asked suddenly. "About Charles?" The question surprised Katherine. They rarely spoke of Thomas's biological father. "Sometimes," she admitted, "not with regret or longing, but with a kind of gratitude, I suppose. If he hadn't abandoned us, we wouldn't be here now." Bryce nodded, understanding. "Thomas asked about him last week. Wanted to know if his real father might come looking for him someday." Katherine stiffened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that being a real father means being there every day, teaching, guiding, loving. That biology doesn't make a man a father. His actions do." Bryce's voice was calm, but Katherine could hear the underlying emotion. "I told him that as far as I'm concerned, he's my son in every way that matters." Katherine leaned against Bryce's shoulder, love for this good, steady man filling her heart. "What did he say to that?" A smile spread across Bryce's face. "He said, 'I know that, Pa. I just wanted to hear you say it.'" Katherine laughed softly. "He's growing up so fast. They all are." "Too fast," Bryce agreed, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Before we know it, they'll be off having adventures of their own." "I hope they find people who love them as well as we love each other," Katherine said, turning her face up to his. Bryce kissed her gently. "They have good examples to follow." As they walked hand in hand back to the house they'd built together, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain of Charles's betrayal had faded to a distant memory, overshadowed by the joy and security she'd found with Bryce. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her that rainy evening at the Socorro trading post had been replaced by confidence and contentment. She thought of the words Bryce had spoken that day, words that had changed the course of her life. "My home needs a family." Simple words, yet they had contained the promise of everything she'd ever wanted: belonging, security, love. And Bryce had kept that promise, giving her not just a home but a life filled with purpose and meaning, a partnership based on mutual respect and unwavering love. The cowboy who had offered shelter to a desperate, pregnant woman had become the center of her world, the foundation upon which she'd rebuilt her shattered dreams. As they reached the house, lights glowing warmly in the windows, Katherine paused to look up at the star-filled desert sky. Somewhere out there, perhaps Charles was still wandering, still searching for whatever it was he thought he'd find in California. She hoped he'd found some measure of peace, even as she silently thanked him for the inadvertent gift he'd given her. For in abandoning her at that trading post 10 years ago, he'd set her on the path to finding what she'd truly been seeking all along: not just a home, but a place where she was valued for herself, where she could grow and flourish, where love was not just a promise but a daily reality. "Coming, my love?" Bryce asked from the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the light from within. "Yes," Katherine answered, turning toward him with a smile. "I'm coming home."